One of the most important aspects of the C programming language is the concept of functions. This is the chapter in which we learn about them. It is next to impossible to write any decent industrial strength program in C without using functions at some point. They are extremely important and an extremely powerful part of the C language. Let's have a look at them now. I guess the first thing we should do is define what a function actually is. Some other languages also have the concept of functions, but they don't call them functions. They call them subroutines, or procedures perhaps. No matter what they're called, they are simply passages of code that have been given a name. A label, if you like. So imagine any simple passage of code. Imagine a passage of code that is 3 statements. Maybe the first statement is printf hello, the second statement is x equals x plus 1, and the third statement is a scanf of some description. So those are 3 statements. Now if you bundle them all together and give them a name, the name, let's invent a good name for that, we could call that special processing. So we could call it, that whole thing could be called special processing. If we get the syntax right, then we've just created for ourselves a function, and that function is called special processing. So what happens then is, if anywhere in our program we decide that we need to perform that exact processing, that exact series of statements, then we simply call them by their name. We simply use the name special processing in our code, and those 3 statements should automatically get run. It saves us an incredible amount of typing because we don't have to type those 3 statements in again manually. A really good example of this is, let's say, printf. Printf is a function. Now it also happens to be a standard C library function, and we've been using it already many times. Now if you were to look in the standard C library source code and find the printf function, you'd find that it is actually a surprisingly complex piece of programming. If you looked in the printf function source code, you would probably find it's about 1,000 lines of code. So how many use printf in any given program? Well, let's say an average of maybe 5 times. Now if we didn't have the printf function written for us, but we did actually know how to do it, and there were no such things as functions, we would actually have to write out those 1,000 lines of code every time we wanted to get that to happen. So in other words, we'd have to write out the 1,000 lines of code maybe 5 times per program. So we would have to write 5,000 lines of code. But of course, as it so happens, that has already been done for us. Those 1,000 lines of code have been gathered together and given a name, and the name they've been given is printf. So all we have to do is call the word printf. We have to write the word printf into our code, and the printf function will run for us. That, as you can probably understand, saves us a dramatic amount of programming time. We've actually used several functions so far, printf being one, scanf of course is another, but we have yet to write our own functions. Well, actually it turns out that we have already written one function. We've written the function called main. Main is kind of a special function. Main is the function that gets automatically called at the beginning of the execution of the program. So if you look at the sequence of code statements that you write in any given program, you can think of them as being all bundled together and put inside some brackets, and above those brackets we've got the word main. So main, the word main has been given as the name that's been given to the code that we've written. So in this chapter we're going to see how to write some other code and give it a different name. And then of course once we've written it, we can then run it as many times as we like. So what are the benefits of having functions in your program? Well, there are 2 main benefits. You've probably already understood one of them by my example using printf, but let's have a look at both of them now just so we know what they are. The first is that it breaks our program up into small and simple chunks. You typically have a chunk of code or a function that performs one particular task. Think about our database program. We've got, maybe 150 lines of code at the moment? Now 150 lines could actually be broken up into much smaller and simpler chunks. We could have a small and simple chunk that reads in the data from the keyboard, and we could have another chunk that prints out the data to the screen. and then we could have yet another chunk that is responsible for, say, for the organization of the various albums in the record shop or whatever. So the idea is that we have one function or one chunk for each particular purpose in our code. That way, when we open up our program, we can jump immediately to the part of the code that we're looking for. In other words, we may have a chunk or a function called input. We may have another function called output. We may have another function called calculations, and so on. So then if somebody has discovered a bug in our program, and the bug is concerned with how the data is printed onto the screen, then it's a relatively simple matter of opening up the source code, finding the output function, which of course we would be responsible for outputting the data to the screen, and modifying that function. They would never have to even look at the other code. The technical term for this is that we modularize our program. We break it up into smaller modules, I guess is probably a better word than using chunks. And then the best part of all about functions, and that's the part that we already kind of understand from the printf example, is that functions are supposed to be reusable. So if we write out all the code once, we can then take the code and use it again for the same purpose or a subtly different purpose at another point or points throughout the execution of our program. In other words, think of printf. We've written printf once, but we can actually use it many, many times. And of course, we don't have to write out all the code for printf more than once. We only have to write it once. We can use it a dozen times or 100 times without adding any extra lines of code to our program. This of course gives us not just the benefit of cutting down on the amount of typing we have to do to write the code, but if we ever need to come back and change something or fix something, we only need to change it in one place. If we had all the one code of printf written out 6 or 7 times, then if we ever needed to change the behavior of printf, we'd need to change it 6 or 7 times for each change. And that of course introduces the problem of, did we get them all, or did I forget one? Okay, so that's about it. Those are the reasons that we create functions. Now that we know what a function is, let's go and see about what they look like, how the syntax of actually creating one.